Handed down for millennia is the legend of Atlantis, a lost civilization that flourished for thousands of years and then was swallowed in an earth-shaking catastrophe brought on by angry gods. Is the story a myth? Or are these fragile images proof that a dazzling but ill-fated culture really existed? Today, scientists are sifting through the rubble of an ancient town for clues to one of the most intriguing mysteries in the history of archaeology.
I'm John Rhys Davis. Join me as we explore the lost city of the Aegean, next on Archaeology.
Around 570 BC, the Greek statesman Solon traveled to Egypt on what today might be called a fact-finding mission. There he heard a story about a rich and powerful island empire that had vanished overnight. Solon's marvelous story was preserved by the philosopher Plato. In his capable hands, it became the timeless cautionary tale of Atlantis. Plato's dialogues describe an ideal city-state where the citizens lived in peace, obeyed their laws, and prospered. But as they grew rich, they became arrogant, angering their gods. In a single day and night, earthquakes and tidal waves rocked the impudent city of Atlantis. In the end, it was utterly destroyed.
For millennia, the story of Atlantis lived on, enchanting, edifying, and completely mythical. But then, in the late 19th century, the ruins of a glittering ancient civilization were discovered in the Aegean, one that had flourished for more than 1,000 years before the rise of classical Greece. Could the story recorded in Plato be a memory of something from this earlier age? Could Plato's Atlantis have been more than an instructive fable?
Here at Knossos, on the island of Crete, a vast royal complex of buildings and courtyards serves as a monument to one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world, the Minoans. Wealthy and powerful, these master shipbuilders sailed the high seas unchallenged. So mighty were the Minoans, who traded as far away as Italy and Egypt, that their cities needed no walls or fortifications. Exquisite artifacts and highly stylized frescoes reveal an advanced culture that was all but lost until a century ago. Philip Betancourt, director of the excavations of Syra, a Minoan town on northern Crete, describes their culture.
The Minoans were a civilization of traders and seafarers. They lived in Crete and were the earliest civilization that we know of in the Aegean. They built palaces and equipped those palaces with many of the things that we would regard as relatively modern. The palaces were bright, they were cheerful, they were attractive to live in, adorned with frescoes, had a sewage system, in many ways a very luxurious plan and a very luxurious way of living.
For 35 years, British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans dug at Knossos. From these excavations emerged a picture of a civilization that had dominated the Aegean for several centuries, and then nothing. Almost overnight, it seemed, the Minoans had met some swift and terrible end. What force could have wiped out so prosperous and powerful a civilization? In 1939, a Greek archaeologist, Spiridos Marinatos, turned to the island of Thera in search of an answer. Thera, also called Santorini, is just 70 miles from Crete. It presents a hellish landscape. Cliffs ribboned with layers of volcanic debris and once molten rock testify to the island's violent past. Its harbor is actually the inside of a volcano so deep no ship's anchor reaches the bottom. In 1628 BC, Thera literally blew itself to pieces in one of the most devastating eruptions in history. Marinatos, an expert in Minoan civilizations, wondered if Thera's catastrophe might have devastated the nearby island of Crete as well. A large enough blast might have triggered a tsunami, a towering wall of water caused by the shock wave of an eruption or earthquake that would have drowned Minoan harbors. The thick ashfall, Marinatos reasoned, may have smothered their crops. Marinatos' theory was met with skepticism. Later, he would travel to Thera searching for evidence, and on the southernmost tip of the island, find much more. Marinatos chose a site where the volcanic ash had been partly eroded by a small stream. The spot would have made an ideal harbor, and more importantly, it faced the island of Crete, the center of the Minoan Empire. In 1967, Marinatos discovered the ancient town of Akrotiri. Entombed by the eruption, Akrotiri had been abandoned and buried in the space of a few weeks. An initial analysis at the site seemed to suggest that Thera's explosion did coincide roughly with the downfall of the Minoans. Had the archaeologists found their smoking gun? Archaeologist Christos Doumas presently heads the project at Akrotiri and continues the work started by the late Marinatos.
The final phase of the city shows that it was a wealthy community, as it is illustrated by the luxurious architecture, the works of art which decorated the buildings, the furniture they have in the houses, plenty of vessels and vases, etc. Since the produce of this wealth cannot be farming, must be shipping and trade.
Such wealth has proved Akrotiri to be a thriving maritime trading center. The houses excavated here were lavishly appointed. Several homes had bathrooms with indoor plumbing, leading to a system of underground ducts. Walls were decorated with highly stylized frescoes, depicting genteel lives devoted to the appreciation of nature, sport, and trade.
Well, we find plenty of artifacts, both big and large and small. Pottery is the major category of artifacts we find. Pottery ranges in sizes from a few centimeters to more than 1 meter. Usually we find remains of food, various cereals, legumes, remains of fish, snails, imported snails, not local. So there was a variety of delicatessen which was imported.
Akrotiri has proven a particularly valuable excavation for those studying Minoan culture.
This is really the first time that we have mud brick walls standing 2 stories high, that we have frescoes in place on the walls, and that we have all of the possessions of the people left in place as they left them. Up to now, we've had to excavate only the foundations of buildings and really rubble rather than intact locations.
This is a layer to watch for. This particular layer here is this white, very indurated ash, and it seems to separate.
For more insight into the magnitude and effects of the blast, Dumas has turned to volcanologist Dr. Floyd McCoy.
It's very pure, it's very fine-grained, it's all over the island. Comparison of the Minoan, a late Bronze Age eruption, with eruptions we might know, it's about twice what Krakatoa was. Krakatoa in 1886. It is 40, 50 times what St. Helens was. Mount St. Helens eruption was just piffle compared to what this was. It was nothing. It was not even the same category or type of eruption, St. Helens. This right now we consider perhaps the 4th largest eruption in the last 20,000 years.
For years before the eruption, tremors must have warned of the coming apocalypse on Thera. But the people of Akrotiri continued to build and live lavishly. Could they have been ignorant of their precarious position? Or had they grown complacent and arrogant?
It's my impression that the Minoans didn't know they were living on a volcano, because I don't think there had been any activity by this volcano for hundreds and perhaps thousands of years before their time. Their first realization, I think, that there was an eruption pending was probably earthquakes. Suddenly, lots of small earthquakes as the magma moved to the surface, which would have made them wonder what's going on. With the earthquakes would have caused landslides along the cliffs along here.
It was a summer day in 1628 BC, the beginning of the end for ancient Akrotiri. The city started to shake violently. Foundations collapsed, walls swayed and slumped. Stone steps, inches thick, snapped under the pressure. While the earth rumbled, a dusting of ash blanketed the city.
Right here is a broken wall in the excavation. This represents earthquake damage done initially to the site. Above it, sitting on top of it, right in here, the thickness of my 3 fingers, is our precursor phase, a precursor ash eruption. It is the combination of this earthquake activity that destroyed buildings, the precursor phase, that told the Minoans to get out, get away. Some disaster is about to happen.
The frightened people of Akrotiri finally realized that this was no ordinary tremor. They abandoned the city for the safety of the surrounding hills, or perhaps fled to Crete and other nearby islands. Then there seems to have been a pause. Evidence has been found that people came back and started to clean the debris from the streets.
Here in the street we found nothing but pumice. And this suggested that the debris of these ruins was removed, which means that people had come back and cleared the streets from the debris. And we find along the side here piles of debris, which were accumulated before the eruption. And it seems that during these operations of accumulating the debris and clearing the streets, perhaps demolishing some dangerous parts of the walls or mending some others, the eruption began.
But then there must have been more tremors, and even the most stout-hearted and foolish abandoned the city. Suddenly, the volcano spewed a column of ash 18 miles into the stratosphere. Pumice, volcanic dust and glass rained down on Akrotiri.
So this is the precursor here. This tells them an eruption is coming. They came back to clean things up, and then they got out fast. Why did they get out fast? Because this portion, the first phase, now comes the big eruption, and the pumice piles up. The pumice, the first phase, the first episode of the eruption, is this portion here. This is what preserved this site. It came in like heavy popcorn, like airfall. It flew through the sky and piled up very gently. If I was standing here, it would just fall all around me and pile up.
The pumice that preserved the city would also preserve the remains of any inhabitants trapped in the ruins, but none have ever been found. Like the more famous ruins at Pompeii, Akrotiri is almost magically frozen in time.
Well, we say Pompeii because it is buried under thick volcanic deposits and the architecture is well preserved. On the other hand, it is true that we did not find any bodies buried under these ruins or the volcanic material. Not only human nor animal bodies were buried. This obviously suggests that people had a warning before the eruption and they had evacuated their city.
Then came the second phase of the eruption. Seawater poured into the newly opened vent of the volcano. It reached the molten magma and triggered an explosion of unparalleled proportions. Instead of drifting downwind, the column of ash collapsed periodically under its own weight.
Suddenly, second phase here, this whole portion here, where they're excavating on top and digging it out, is second phase. This is probably the most disastrous part of eruptions like this. Here are ash flows coming and sweeping through here. If I was standing here and buried by the pumice, this top part of my head would be decapitated by these flows zipping past. This is what destroyed much of this village.
In the third phase of the eruption, the spent volcano collapsed catastrophically in upon itself, hurtling boulders and magma for miles in all directions.
This large rock here was thrown in here during the third phase of the eruption. It was thrown from that direction there by the volcano and thrown in the air and came all the way down here and breaking down the walls right here. And you can see this wall is broken and the wall up there is broken. So it came in from this direction here, landed, plopped through there, plopped down right here, causing damage. In other words, this penetrated through all the other volcanic deposits that were already piled up here.
Still, the nightmare continued. The massive cloud caused by the eruption generated violent thunderstorms and torrential rains, heralding the fourth and final phase of the disaster. Rain mixed with ash and pumice to form a mudflow. The first mudflow swept into Akrotiri and poured through the town's doors and windows. Any buildings left exposed were quickly wiped away by a second mudflow. By the end of the eruption, the destruction of Akrotiri was complete. The affluent Minoan outpost had disappeared under acres of volcanic ash. Its harbor, if indeed there had been one, had vanished from the map of Thera. This quaint jaunt over the rugged terrain of Thera is no picnic in the Aegean sun. It is high-tech archaeology, ground-penetrating radar. Using the same radar that planes use to scan the horizon, the archaeologists probe the layers of ancient Akrotiri. The radar reveals a wealth of information about what lies buried in the opaque and unremarkable dirt of Thera.
This is a picture, an X-ray of this building taken with the ground-penetrating radar walking across the top of the building on the backside where it has not been excavated. And what the diagram clearly shows, in a green line across the middle, is this ground floor here remaining intact. It shows the lower floor here, the upper floor here. And this jumble of material here indicates there has been collapse. Collapse over here, that's this part here, and a little bit of collapse back over here. But what this is demonstrating to an archaeologist is the fact that this building is largely intact inside.
To the archaeological prospectors at this site, the radar picture might represent proverbial gold. A Minoan house, more than 3,500 years old. In the aftermath of the spectacular eruption, like insects trapped in amber, buildings were preserved in ash. One thing is clear from the excavations. The devastation at Thera was absolute. The eruption of the volcano here surpasses any other in human history. But the question remains, could it have triggered the collapse of the vast and powerful Minoan civilization? Could the shock of the eruption have sent stories-high waves of seawater crashing into the coast of Crete 70 miles away, inundating the heart of the Minoan Empire? Did the terrible cloud of ash and volcanic glass drift downwind from Thera to rain down upon her sister island?
Well, they had some effects, certainly. Earthquakes, we know, cause damage on Crete. But we know from other eruptions of this magnitude that tsunamis were produced, but I don't think they caused much devastation on Crete. Ash clouds certainly went towards Crete. We can map that. They went as far as Turkey and Israel. We can find bits of it in the Nile Delta. But the ash itself was probably only maybe 4 to 10 centimeters deep on Crete, no more, and then only on eastern Crete. Ash of this thickness does no damage. We know from Mount St. Helens that ash thicknesses of less than perhaps half a meter actually enrich the soil. Certainly the tsunami did damage. The tsunami caused damage to their seaports. The major tsunami, however, went out this way. That was the biggest one when the collapse occurred out there. Small tsunami certainly went out in all directions as the various pyroclastic flows entered the ocean. And certainly there was damage from tsunamis, but I don't think enough to cause great devastation and loss of a whole Minoan empire.
Today, scientists believe the eruption on Thera probably struck at the heart of Minoan civilization. But the death blow dealt to this affluent culture came not from the whim of nature. It more likely took the form of that uniquely human disaster, war.
The final destruction is a destruction by fire, and probably means that Crete was destroyed by war, though we can never be absolutely certain of this.
Even though no solid evidence has ever been found, the myth of Atlantis and the eruption at Thera draw very strong parallels. Could Plato's Atlantis be more than just a morality tale?
It's a very tempting theory, and certainly it suggests a memory of some kind of a cataclysm, very much like the one that we know occurred at Thera. So it's very tempting to say yes, but it'll remain unproved.
Was this Atlantis? That's a delicious question. I don't know, but the marine fresco shows a big, huge city, a prominent city, sitting right here where we think that embayment was, and it's now gone, blasted away by the eruption. You have to consider that this clearly was a spiritual and cultural center for a Cycladic, a Minoan civilization. It's hard to say. I'd like to think it was.
Floyd McCoy is hardly alone in wanting to think that the Atlantis story has roots in reality. It is one slice of Plato's work that seems to reach all of us in one fantastic form or another. It is a tale that refuses to die. There is hope for the romantics among us. The archaeologists sifting through the rubble of Thera feel that after nearly 30 years of excavation, they've barely scratched the surface of ancient Akrotiri. The real glories of this lost city may still lie buried at the edge of a volcano whose rages, for now, have been stilled.